Okay, now we're going to look at a game played in 2008 at the Melody Amber tournament. And this was a blindfold rapid game you played against Sergei Karyakin.
Yeah. I had some very mixed results in blindfold, it has to be said. Last time I played in 2011, I scored -2 in the blindfolds. And I scored +8 in the in the rapid. So there you go.
Do you enjoy blindfold games or blindfold tournaments?
Not too much. I find it a bit too hard.
Yeah.
Isn't it the Homer Simpson? Anything that's hard to do ain't worth doing. I kind of like that.
I did see a YouTube video of you giving a 10-board blindfold simul, I think, at one point. So you do them on occasion, but
yeah,
not your favorite.
I don't know. I train blindfold all the time. That's just the way it is. You calculate blindfold all the time, but I find playing blindfold just in tournaments pretty difficult. It's an interesting challenge from a scientific point of view, and to try and challenge yourself. So that's why I do it from time to time, but it is tough.
Yeah, actually, in one of your games with the Ronian we were looking at, you were talking about his body language. And it occurred to me, if that were a blindfold game, you wouldn't have that information. So there's some extra stuff that's conveyed when you can see your opponent.
That's true. Okay, so I guess even in a blindfold game, in these games, we're sitting on a computer on an empty board, so we can actually see our opponents.
Okay.
See some body language. Like in one of the rounds when I was playing Svidler, and I didn't make a move for a few minutes because I thought I was white, and I didn't really understand why the move E4 was on the board.
Just wondering why you're thinking so long.
I won that game, so it was okay. Okay, so let's go with this one. Blindfold game. Najdorf. Had some interesting Najdorfs in that tournament. I played white against Gelfand, in which I played H3, which was one of the first sort of, I think, modern games at the very highest level with H3. And I think Karyakin was praised for playing a novelty, I think against Van Wely later on, which the novelty was basically that he went knight d5 in this position, which was a big thing. So the only thing I would object to there is that I had this particular position against Gelfand, and he didn't play b4. So those who praised him for the novelty, did they think I was going to do something other than knight d5 in this position? Like, I feel like sometimes you have to look at things a bit in context.
Probably why Gelfand didn't play b4.
It's certainly why he didn't play b4. So that has bothered me quite a bit, that he got all the credit for that novelty.
Novelty judges, you're hereby notified.
Yeah, exactly. And I should note, though, that playing H3 was not completely my idea. I just asked some of the Dutch guys on one day, I think it was Smits, who told me you should play H3 against Najdorf. He didn't tell me anything more, so I had to figure out the rest myself. But anyway, that's a bit of a digression. But once again, knight d5. I'm sure lots and lots of people had the idea of going knight d5. But I just want to make sure that everybody knows that had Gelfand played b4, I think he played h6 instead. And to be fair, I did beat him pretty badly in that game. That I would.
Did you get to play knight d5 later at any point in that game?
No, but I got to sacrifice some other things.
Okay.
We can bring the game around. just for fun, for some good memories.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, I guess against Karyakin, I wanted to do something else. Mm-hmm. So, but I'm pretty sure it was 2008. There was this whole H3
craze with the Atoms attack.
Yeah, but now everybody does it. So, but in those days, it was still like it's that old move that Fischer played, which is not really that great. That's what people were thinking. Okay. Anyway, Bishop E2, E5. Well, this is all pretty standard stuff. This is a pretty passive line for Black, to be fair. Since we're getting an opposite color bishop position where his bishop is a bit passive. You could play D3. I think Sutovsky played it against somebody maybe against Ganguly in 2004. Which is a way to play. Like you desperately want to open the game up for the bishop. But most of the games in this line actually went Queen A5, and then people would go Rook E8, Rook E5, I think. And here, what's the big idea? Like I think G4 maybe.
Yeah.
And the point was I think B4.
Yeah, I saw a game like this.
Yeah, or I'm not sure it was exactly like this, but anyway, the point was always this: to go like B4 and F4, trying to restrict the black rook or ideally trap it.
Somehow, this is a line I could not see you playing as black.
No, this is just a bit too sad.
Yeah.
So Karyakin, I remember, was playing very quickly, so he clearly prepared this at some point. I'll just mention another game I had from the World Cup in 2007. So that was just a few months before this. I had against Dominguez. I think he went Bishop G5. No. Yeah, of course. He went, obviously, Bishop G5 first to prevent castling. After Rook D1, he went Knight C6. And
inviting you to take.
Inviting me to take, which is actually not a big deal. Like, I take, and at least that's what my second at the time, who was Lee, who was also preparing that Adams game we were talking about earlier. He found that didn't actually give anything, so he came up with A3 instead. And the thing is, after what happened, Dominguez played this. It turned out that also this opposite colored bishop position is not quite as equal as it looked. What happened is that, surprisingly, my bishop has a little more potential than his has, because this one is restricting his bishop a bit. It's also restricting his other pieces a bit. So what happened is that I managed to go castle, bishop G4, G3, F4, and I actually got some initiative. And also an important point is that after I go F4, then I can occupy the C file while he cannot.
You're controlling it from a distance. And the knights kind of cancel each other out.
The knights, so
D5.
It's obviously pretty close to equal. Maybe he could go something like H5 immediately here, but I thought it was cool, and it shows that these opposite color bishop positions are not always so easy. Anyway, what happened in the game? Bishop E5. This is just so sad. I understand that it's pretty close to equal, but still, my bishop is better than his. It's not hemmed in by my pawns, and it's just pleasant for white. So what I did is I decided to exchange one pair of rooks, and I go F4 to prevent rook E5, I suppose. Not sure if that was even necessary, but I'm also trying to restrict his bishop even further.
And why did you voluntarily trade? That's a decision a lot of people will be like, oh, aren't we conditioned not to give up the file? Shouldn't we avoid that?
The thing is, the file doesn't matter. He has no entry squares. And I guess I just thought, for once, I'm not sure if I want to allow rook e5 to have that tension there. If I go f4 immediately, it's got rook e3.
And you don't want to take and allow him to undouble his pawns like that.
No,
his bishop.
no, I don't want that. And I also thought with one rook less, the game would be easier to control, and that he would have less pieces to defend his queen side.
Okay.
So let's just see what happened. I went f4. Maybe he could have done something like g5 at some point. Not really sure there, but let's just see what happened. So b4. Trying to gain some space on the queen side, hoping to push the pawn to a5 and then later on play b5 and open up an attack against the pawn on b7. He plays very simply, and I'll go g5 as well. So here he could have given a check on c3. As a matter of fact, I was intending just to go rook b2 and king b2 and ask him what he's doing. Probably he's fine here, but I was just going to be patient because I felt like king a4 was a bit too much here.
That looks extreme.
And it should be noted that the outpost on c3 doesn't give him that much. It's the same that would happen if he would plant the rook on e3 at some point. For instance, here with the rook on e1, it would make a lot of sense because he would double the rooks and force my rook away because I don't want to take. But with one rook and this pawn bishop securely defended, it just doesn't do very much. Yeah, so let's see what happened. Trying to gain space on the other side as well. Probably what he should have done now is to go h6. And just to prevent me from restricting his position further. If I go rook h3, he's got rook c3. Very important not to allow g5. Bishop, rook on c8, rook c3, g5. Let's say if I take, I can win a pawn, but it doesn't matter. You can even go a5 here, exchanging another pair of pawns. f6, bringing the bishop around. It's just it's a dead draw. So that's, I guess, especially in blindfold, when you cannot see the board quite as clearly as you would in normal chess. That's something that's possible to miss. Another plan that you mentioned, I think, is bishop to e1.
Yeah, our publishing manager Geert mentioned this move too.
Yeah, I was thinking rook h3 and rook h8, and I would just go ahead with my plan of going f5, using a small tactical trick. I think if g5, f6 could be pretty strong, even rook h6 first and then pushing the pawn. And if he takes, I have the feeling like even rook h7 could be very dangerous, since bishop might come back here. And it's not so obvious that this particular bishop, opposite color bishop ending, is a draw. If I want to, I can go bishop h7 first, not exchanging rooks immediately. And it's not so obvious how he would force trade of rooks. Let's look at lines like this, for instance. Rook f3, if king g7, there's bishop c8, and he's in some trouble. Maybe king e7 is more Yeah, king e7. It's the same. So it's he has to go h6, I think. Otherwise, his game is very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just see what happens in the game. You can see from this point on, he's made very little progress. He's put his pawns on light squares, which is not ideal, and I've gained so much space. And now...
Yeah, you're expanding on both wings.
I'm expanding on both wings, and I've gained a lot of territory.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently f5 is a mistake, which is not obvious to me. It feels like I've already achieved so much here that defending the black position would be very, very difficult. I'm intending to go h4, possible f5 at some point. There's the other plan of a5 and b5. There's so many possibilities here that I find it very, very difficult to defend.
Mm-hmm.
So he could play f6 and wait. Let's say I go b5 immediately. Then I'm pushing the other pawn. It's not so easy to defend still. I go h5 and he has very clear problems.
All right.
So it's hard to call. It's hard to call this a decisive mistake, but the problem now is that these pawns are going to be really weak. He goes h5. He does believe in fortresses.
Yeah,
this guy.
He's on record.
Yeah, he's on record, and he showed it to great effect against me as well. To be fair, but he just wants to keep everything closed. The problem now is that b5 is happening. And his bishop is absolutely awful compared to my bishops, which clearly has possibilities from b5 happening very soon. It's gonna be active. His bishop is awful, and my pawns are further advanced, so he's gonna have a bunch of problems once the game opens up. It's worth showing that he had problems regardless of what he would do here. Rook e8 allows b5 with this little trick that AB bishop b5 loses.
Mm-hmm.
You could try something like king d8. This is also pretty bad. b5 and then rook e1. I can just go rook e6. And his bishop is so bad that he cannot actually save the game. If he tries to get the bishop into the game, I don't think he's actually really in time. If he goes for bishop d6, I got king d6, and my pawns are faster, I think. Let's just make sure. Bishop d3, there's a4, and if it takes a5, and this bishop is not going to move, and he can't stop my pawns.
It can just never participate in the defense.
Yeah, absolutely. And if he goes king c7 instead, I go a4, bishop d6, bishop e2, maybe. Bishop f4, e7. This was not quite as obvious, so I'm really curious, because I see the line that the guys are giving here is king d7, and then we win quite easily, actually, because the pawns on both sides are too dangerous. So, but d5, at least you can try there.
I'm starting to see why Sutovsky preferred d3.
Yeah,
his bishop always blocked by this pawn on d4.
No, absolutely. His bishop has a really, really sad life in this game.
And even in some of those lines, you're just looking at black has to push the d pawn to have a chance in some instances.
For sure. I think in those lines, I could also play it more slowly. I could push the pawn to a5 first. And his counterplay, I don't think is really going to work. Because my rook is going to invade at some point. But it was worth trying. Anyway, he goes rook e8. And this, I think, is still pretty instructive. You cannot take on b5. So I take on a6. And now he's got this huge weakness on a6, which he cannot really do anything about. And my king is just coming into the game. King b6, trying to prevent that. There's rook b1, king a7, king a5. It's all very, very sad. King c5, I got rook b7. Bishop is being harassed, and it's really, really bad news for him.
You'd have to close your eyes to play bishop h8, even in a blindfold game.
Yeah. No, he needs to go bishop f8, but I just go king a5. It should be very, very bad and pretty easy to win.
Yeah.
So he goes rook e3, but this is desperation. King touches down on a6. I got rook e1. And now...
threatening rook e7.
Yeah, threatening rook e7, and his bishop is going to be lost. So, king d8, bishop b5, king b7 next. Will complete the mating net. If rook f4, I can just win his bishop. So he goes d3, king b7. And I guess he plays on, because in blindfold chess there's always the chance you've missed where some piece is, but there wasn't really anything here. Rook c1 just to be safe. Rook d1. Pawn goes forward, and that's it.
Excellent. Yeah, beautiful blindfold display right there.
Yeah, I think he was fairly accommodating, and the position from early on is pretty pleasant, but by no means won. It's just one of those positions that is slightly better, and it's not going to be a forced draw, and that means that it's going to be unpleasant.
Yeah, at the top level, that very much seems like the type of middle game where you're playing for two results, basically, if we can use that saying.
Absolutely, it's something that people try and avoid by all means. Yeah.
So just to wrap this game up, what are a couple big picture items that improving players might take away from how you converted that?
So first of all, be careful of going into opposite color bishop endings when your bishop is hemmed in by your own pawns. Even though it looks solid, if there's just one rook on the board, if there were no rooks, it wouldn't matter. It would usually be a draw anyway. But if there's just one rook on the board, then there are a whole lot of resources. And a bishop like this, that is protected by a pawn and is free, is a very dangerous weapon in such lines. And the ability to advance on both flanks and potentially change the pawn structure while your opponent cannot do that is an important tool.
Yeah.
I would guess, looking back, I would be tempted to suggest g5 here.
Extreme measures.
Yeah,
to stop
just
expansion.
to stop the expansion, but it doesn't solve all these problems. And the point is, I guess, even though such positions can be drawn, they're objectively pretty close to equal. Try and avoid them unless you've got clear instructions from your coach that you need to improve your defense in passive positions. In case, please go ahead. But in general, I wouldn't recommend it.
Try it in your training games first and go from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And this is not even a position I would be too worried about if I was in an almost must-win game as white, because I know that even though there's not much of an advantage at all, it's not going away. The position is not going to be a forced draw, and as long as it's not a forced draw, there are always chances.
Yeah, plenty of chances, and great points for the improving player. Now we'll take a look at a game Magnus played in 2019 at the Sinkfield Cup. Pretty late in the tournament, I believe, around 10. Against
9
Wesley
draws.
So. Oh, 9 draws up to this point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Won the last 2 games, then lost to Ding in the playoff.
Is that your longest draw streak certainly in a single tournament? That would be pretty hard to beat.
No, but I've started with 9 draws before.
Uh-huh.
And 7 draws in Vacancy this year. So some of my worst streaks have been pretty recently.
Despite coming off your best chess year.
Yeah. So let me just start. I played 1e4. I played a lot of forcing 1d4 stuff in the tournament, and although I'd gotten some decent positions, it hadn't really gotten me anywhere. So I just decided to play something else, and I went for the Italian, like all the other guys are doing. So Wesley went for this concept of going a6 then a5, which I think Anon has been doing quite a bit. At least he's the main proponent of that line. And now I guess the point is that bishop e6 is kind of decent with because if you take fe, then white doesn't have that space advantage on the queen side that we seem to discuss in every endgame.
Recurring theme here.
Yeah. So I went for this instead, which is also not great. And I just came up with this idea of knight c4 over the board, which I thought, why not? One of the reasons why I went for it is that I didn't see what his best line was. Mm-hmm. But as it happened in the game, it turned out to be pretty instructive. And I really don't know why this one is in the endgame section, because this one should be.
This might go in the strategy.
Yeah, it should be. It should be. Shouldn't have said that. Anyway, so knight c4. There were also moves like queen e2 here. Basically, black position on the queen side is a little bit ugly, but he has enough resources to compensate for it. So he took on c4. Knight d7 looks pretty awful, but apparently it's quite playable as well. Knight e3 goes to d5, but he can sit and wait. Rook d8 and rook b8. But who's gonna play this way? Yeah, it looks really ugly. Mm-hmm. I guess the point is whenever white goes c4, then knight comes back. So he takes, and he went b6 very quickly, which is probably a mistake. Like it's the most obvious move by far, but what he should have done is he should have gone rook c8. So my plan is I want to bring the knight around to d5, and the best way to do it is h2 f1 usually. So let's say this, rook c7, knight c8, knight e3, rook b1, and f3. I've sacrificed a pawn, but his knight is a bit stranded, and well, there are possibilities for both sides here. But he does have counterplay.
So with one strategic decision, knight c4, you're accepting 3 isolated pawns, 2 of which are double isolated pawns. I mean, a lot of people find that shocking, but...
Yeah, the thing is, he has some weak pawns as well. Mm-hmm. And besides, there is a precedent. Mm-hmm. There are games by Botvinnik. He used to love this structure. Right. He would play the Nimzo Indian, and then he would accept these double pawns on c3 and c4. He would take on e5 or at c5 at some point, set up this pawn on e4 and bring a knight to d5.
Yep.
The idea is that this double pawn on c3 actually is an asset because it prevents the black knight from reaching d4, and that is really the whole idea here. So I guess I said after the games that it was a bit of an homage to Botvinnik.
Yeah.
Obviously, that kind of statement is always a bit nonsensical. Like, I played the move not because it was going to be an homage, but because I believed it was probably quite good.
Yeah.
But you know. Anyway, he goes for b6, and I go for knight h4. So earlier I was talking a bit about knight h2 and that this was the best route to d5. I think in this case I may have wanted to force him to make a decision whether he wanted to play g6 or not. I think that was what I wanted here, and also getting the knight to f5 might be useful. So he goes rook d8 and I go f3, and he goes g6. And here, this was a really difficult decision. I think I may have made a bit of a poor choice here, but it's really hard, because once you go g4 in this position, it's gonna be really hard to open up a second front. Let's imagine that black defends everything on the king side. He allows the knight to get to d5. The question is gonna be, then what?
You don't have as much leverage for the f4 break.
No, exactly. So I wanted to keep my structure more fluid, but the problem is that here, first of all, the pawn may be hanging on g3 in some lines, and secondly, f5 is an issue. So it's really double-edged and probably not great. So he attacks it immediately, king f2, and exactly here he could have gone knight c6, knight c8, knight d6, and he could have gone f5, and probably with enough counterplay. Anyway, he didn't do that. Knight c6. He has a pretty simple idea here. After knight g2, he just wants to take on d1. Go rook d8. In case I take, he's gonna take knight e3. He's gonna play knight f6, knight d7, and believe me, this is pretty rock solid. So I need to keep at least one rook on the board, and that is why I'm going bishop c1. King g7, bishop e3, rerouting that bishop. Now I'm thinking that the bishop is not as vulnerable on e3 as it was on a3, and it also covers this particular invasion square in case I want to take and go rook b1. So here you should once again have gone for counterplay, but he didn't, and here you can see the point of what I was doing earlier on. Rook b1, had the bishop been on a3 here, he would have had rook d2, rook a2 with a bunch of counterplay. Here he doesn't.
Goes passive.
Yeah, he goes passive. Bishop f2, preparing the knight. Getting there, and now I've got exactly what I wanted. f5 is simply going to be met by king d3. Doesn't really achieve much, and he's simply pretty passive now. And his next move is really bad. He goes knight e7, which is simply not very good. I go knight d5. If he does go with the knight to c8, I'm just going to take on c5. And it's amazing how fast his position goes downhill.
Yeah.
It's very important now, by the way, that I have a dark square bishop. In a lot of search positions, you would have a light squared bishop, let's say on d3, when the dynamic possibilities would be rather limited compared to what they are now.
Yeah, you put a bishop on d3 and only black has chances there.
Yeah. I wouldn't say so. I would say that b6 is still too weak. That people, I think, tend to overestimate the power of the blockading knight, especially one like this. Let's say you put a white bishop on d3 and a pawn on c4. I would say that white is at least not worse.
Okay, interesting.
Because this knight mostly has defensive power.
Yeah.
So you tend to think that knight comes to d6, you're going to get f5 at some point. But really, the opening of the position is not really going to favor black too much. And I think with such a glaring weakness as b6, then it's not actually a position where black can hope for something. Okay. And I think that's one of the sorts of position where the computer has helped us understand it better. Like, I would agree. Let's say a few years ago, I would say black is at least not worse. But now I would say that black is okay, but black is still the one who is slightly worse, if anybody.
In that hypothetical situation.
In that hypothetical situation where we put the white bishop on d3 and white pawn on c4.
Got it.
And remove the bishop on f2, obviously.
In this case, you have the perfect piece to break.
I have absolutely the perfect piece. It hits the pawn on c5. It's going to hit the pawn on e5 later. And this means that his position, which looks quite fortressy at first glance, is actually not that at all. So king d3, I could also have played c4 immediately, but I thought there was no need. If he goes c4, b5, bishop c5 loses. If it goes knight c8, I can just go bishop c5 even here.
And f4 coming at some point?
F4 is coming at some point, and it's going to be pretty bad. So he goes f5 instead. I happily play c4. And here he just realized that he's probably lost. Should be noted that if he tries to play, let's say g5, I'm just going to go c4. And I think his position is just going to collapse. Bishop c3 eyeing a5, which means that he cannot move his knight because that will be a pin. Next, I'm gonna play f4. Takes, rook f1, and this cannot be held, I think. Rook f4 next.
Yeah, it's so visually interesting because in that situation we're just looking at with black having pawns on e5, g5, everything is on a dark square against the dark square bishop.
Yeah.
You would think, oh, okay, black's solid here, but
no.
That pawn leverage you got.
And what happened in the game? So this is why I didn't go g4 in the game.
Coming full circle.
Yeah, exactly. So exactly in the kind of scenario which happened in the game, that's why I wanted to keep the pawn on g3. And it could be, I could very much imagine that, let's say I go g4 here, that he just has a stone cold fortress.
Yeah. Too solid.
Yeah, it's just too solid.
No breaks.
No breaks. So in the game I have one break, but that one break seems to be more than enough. Okay, so he goes f5. He takes. Yeah, I talked about this after the game, actually, in the tournament commentary, that a scenario like this where he just tries to this is obviously a hypothetical line, but where he just tries to close everything would fail pretty miserably. we got a situation where the position is blocked. Let's just, for good measure, give black a couple of extra moves here. So the position is completely blocked. Not so much. Bishop c3. And we got ourselves a situation where all the black pawns are in dark squares. Position is completely blocked. And if you could pass, he would be okay.
Yeah.
But he cannot. It's Zugsfang.
Yeah.
If he moves the knight, bishop a5 is going to come. If he moves the rook, either bishop a5 comes after rook b8 or rook b6 comes. If he moves the king, e5 falls. And regardless of what happens, it's an easy win.
Right.
So what happened in the game is he took rook f8, his last chance to be active in this game, and setting a little trap which you should never ever fall for. Obviously, rook takes b6, not knight c4, but rook e3. Knight c4.
Yeah.
And
That would be tragic.
yeah, it would be pretty bad. But I took on b6. I didn't really calculate this much, but I just felt intuitively with these central pawns, this is not going to be an issue at all. And this attitude led me to play king e2 here, which was incredibly dumb. Just king d2. Let's say it takes, I can go rook e6, or even simpler, I can go rook c6, take on c5, push the d pawn. I can also take the a pawn. It's not even close. Instead, I go king e2, thinking what difference does it make? He's going to take on g3. I'm going to go rook e6 or rook c6. Probably even better. I mean, what's the problem? I'm just queening the pawns. And he goes rook c3, and now you realize that it's simply not easy to win at all. Which is just such an unpleasant feeling. Since now he will get to this very important pawn. And this is not really the point of the game. I just wanted to show it. Anyway, he blundered immediately, played king f6, and I went d6, and that was it. I had some ideas of how I was going to win the game after king f8. Crucially, not by playing d6, because then rook d4, e5, a4, let's say king e3, rook d5 would be a draw. I cannot make progress because king e4 runs into rook d4 check. So I need to play rook e6 instead. And here I was intending after king f7 to play king f3. And this should actually win pretty handily, after all, invading with the king. But why? That's the question. Why would he want to do this? It's also interesting what happens if he goes rook d4, intending to push the pawns immediately. I go king f3, still protecting e4. Now it becomes a race, and somehow white wins. It's important to note that you go king g4 instead of king f4, because otherwise this last line c1 will be checked.
Yep.
But this would have taken some talent, obviously, while in the game. King f6, d6. So it's that principle again. Always be vigilant towards right till the very end, whether you're on the pressing side or on the winning side or on the defending side or on the losing side. It always pays off. And I know that I sin against this principle again and again because it's so difficult. But I can say learn from learn from what I say, not from what I do. But most of the time, you can learn from what I do as well.
Right, definitely. And learning from the classics, that buffing game, even though, as you said, you made that move just because it was objectively the move that appealed to you most. But always helps to know like the structural origins of plans like that, because I just think for a lot of players that's just a shocking decision to play knight c4.
I think it's all about two things. It's all about that knight coming to d5, which it is gonna come to d5 at some point. That's very hard to prevent, and it is about that c3 pawn preventing black from planting a knight on d4. So you're basically, I agree that it looks ugly, but you're basically arguing that the white structure is actually better.
Yep. Controls a lot of squares.
And you're arguing that the open B file is also
right. I always tell my students that double pawns yield open files.
And I think another point which is interesting to make is that this bishop, which went to a3 and was so hopelessly blocked on a3, actually became a monster.
Yeah.
Right at the end. There's always potential when your opponent's pawns are on the dark squares, on the same square as your bishop, that it may become a very important piece at some point. And I think this was not Wesley's best game at all. Like, normally he would play a bit more inspired than this. But nevertheless, it was.
And the reason he's so conclusively lost here compared to King f8 is.
Yeah, exactly. He the pawns simply run.
Right. He can't attack your rook, stay attacking your rook as he could with the king on f8.
Yeah, that's right. So, okay, let me just make sure that I don't mess up. So here, he should actually have tried this, just to force me to make one good move. The thing is here, e6. This may not be crystal clear, or maybe not clear at all. So I should go g4.
Throw that in first.
Throw that in. His king is no longer attacking e6, which means that I can go rook f7, but I can also simply go rook e8 and then rook c8. And this pawn will run.
Right. Okay, very instructive. And I think the final point that was very interesting for me to hear was you said g3 was actually quite a difficult decision, deciding between g3 and g4.
Oh yeah, for sure. As I said, normally I would make the move that I think is the best at the time, and I feel very strongly that like g4 is the natural move. You want to prevent this whole knight h5 business. First of all, you need to play g3 or g4 in order to get the knights into play. And g4 is good from a positional point of view, preventing f5, preventing knight h5, putting the pawn on the opposite square of the opposite color of your own bishop. Like, everything is good about that decision positionally. So normally I would make it without thinking. It just occurred to me that maybe after g4 there's not going to be a breakthrough. And that really bothered me. Like, as we saw in these other lines, after rook is exchanged, the knight is exchanged on d5, then black plays g5 and there's just nothing.
Yep.
So I guess sometimes you gotta worry about the long-term breakthrough as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes it pays off. But it's very hard to strike a balance there. So I cannot really recommend exactly when you should do that and when you shouldn't. It really all depends on the situation.
Yeah.
maybe another time I would have played g4, and it would have ended in a draw, and we would go back, and I would say maybe I should have gone g3 there. But then, there's knight h5, and there's f5 later on.
Yeah.
But it's also a question of style. I was playing against Wesley on a day after he'd lost a pretty bad game to Jan Nepomniachtchi's white, and it occurred to me that he might not be in the mood where he will find the very best counterplay or go for the very best counterplay. As long as he felt that he could do something pretty solid, then he was probably going to do that instead. As you can see here, for instance, going for knight c6 instead of knight c8 looks very decent. Like, after the most obvious move, knight g2, then he would exchange both rooks, and in this case, his decision would certainly have been vindicated.
Yeah.
So it's all very fine margins, but
yeah. That's just so great that that highlights the importance of thinking about those pawn breaks and where you may break in the future, how to set it up. Yeah. And even thinking about the difference between G3 versus G4, I think is kind of a hallmark of a strong player and something to aspire to for students of this course, because there's a lot of maneuvering, but eventually the pawns, as we see in many of the games, they're deciding the action.
Absolutely. And this is also a thing you could you could see from looking with the computer, that the computer would probably criticize the move G3 because it has a lower value than G3, in the sense that G4 simply is a better positional move. Mm-hmm. But maybe in this particular sense, you need G3 in order to preserve winning chances. Although it also is also more risky in the sense that black gets counter chances. I had a game against Hu Yifan in Vaikonsei a few years ago. We had a structure in the center. I think I had c4, e4 against d6, e6, and e5. Mm-hmm. So sort of a Sicilian structure there. I think we only had one knight each, as well as a couple of rooks and the queen. And I just so stubbornly refused to play f3 at some point for many moves. Peter was watching the game and he was thinking, like, why are we not playing f3? That's really obvious. But I just thought very strongly that I needed the third rank for the rook in order to make serious progress. Or the queen. So I would make all sorts of awkward moves in order to avoid playing f3. I think this is a bit of the same point, that I'm making this really awkward move g3 because it's a bit weakening. It's a bit loose, but it was all about that. It was all about keeping more options for the future in the end game, and I can say that from a practical point of view, it was probably a good decision, and it certainly paid off.
Definitely, and it's so funny as a passive viewer just playing through this game. This looks like a harmonious move to me in view of what you did next.
Yeah, for sure.
Get the knight to d5 in the most efficient way.
But I think it's really interesting, the fact that you cannot really explain this by looking at computer analysis.
Yeah,
and that's what makes it interesting. That a computer will not tell you about the difference between G3 and G4 here. It will probably just tell you that G4 is a better move, and it doesn't. It just wants to evaluate the position. It doesn't care whether you can break through 15 or 20 or even 30 moves from that.
Right. And that's why we appreciate you having you in the studio, telling us the difference between G3 or G4 as you perceive it. So, good stuff. And nice example of breaking down the blockade attempt rather quickly in that game.
So, yeah, obviously it's not always going to be that quick. But Yeah, it's a good example of how such a solid position can collapse pretty quickly, and that making a subtle assessment of the position early on is sometimes very important.
Agreed. And thanks once again for taking us through it.